Emma couldn't survive one day in real combat. Derek Carter's voice carried across the backyard, loud enough for every relative at the barbecue to hear. Laughter followed almost immediately. A few cousins chuckled into their paper cups. An uncle shook his head with an amused smile. Even some of the neighbors gathered near the grill glanced over to see how Emma would react. She didn't. She simply stood beside the picnic table, arranging hamburger buns into neat rows while the late afternoon Texas sun painted long shadows across the grass. The smell of charcoal and smoked brisket drifted through the warm air. Children chased each other between lawn chairs. Country music played softly from a speaker sitting near the porch. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary family barbecue. But for Emma Carter, family gatherings had always been exercises in patience. Derek leaned back in his chair and grinned as though he had just delivered the joke of the century. At 32, he loved being the center of attention. He drove a brand new pickup truck, talked loudly about business deals nobody fully understood, and somehow managed to make every conversation about himself. Today was no different. "I'm serious," he continued. Emma disappears for months at a time, comes back with some vague government job story, and everyone acts like she's doing something important. More laughter. Emma kept stacking buns. Her expression never changed. She had learned years ago that defending herself only encouraged people like Derek. Across the yard, her grandmother sat quietly beneath a shade umbrella. She watched the exchange without saying a word. She knew Emma better than anyone else in the family. She knew there were reasons behind the long absences, reasons Emma never discussed. Derek grabbed a soda and pointed toward his cousin. "You know what I think? I think she works some boring office job and makes it sound mysterious so nobody asks questions." The crowd laughed again. Emma placed the final bun on the tray and brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "You could be right," she said calmly. Her answer only encouraged him. "See? Even she won't deny it." The laughter grew louder. Near the grill, an older man slowly turned his attention toward the conversation. Robert Kane had spent most of the afternoon quietly cooking burgers and keeping to himself. The retired Navy SEAL was a neighbor of Emma's uncle and had been invited as a courtesy. He was in his late 60s now, broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver hair and weathered hands that moved with deliberate precision. Until that moment, he had barely spoken. He simply listened. Emma picked up a serving tray and started toward the patio. Her phone vibrated inside her pocket. She paused for half a second. Most people didn't notice. Robert Kane did. Emma glanced at the screen. Something changed in her eyes. Not fear. Not concern. Focus. Pure focus. She stepped away from the crowd and answered the call in a low voice. The words were barely audible above the music and conversation. Almost nobody heard them. Nobody except the retired SEAL standing beside the grill. The metal tongs slipped from Robert Kane's hand and landed against the barbecue with a sharp clang. His head turned instantly toward Emma. His eyes narrowed. Because after decades around military operators, there was one phrase he never expected to hear at a family barbecue. Falcon actual speaking. For a moment, the sounds of the barbecue seemed to fade into the background. The laughter, the music, the clatter of paper plates and soda cans all blurred together as Robert Kane watched Emma standing near the edge of the patio with her phone pressed against her ear. She spoke quietly, her words too soft for anyone else to hear, but Robert was not listening for volume. He was listening for rhythm. There was a difference. During his years in the military, he had met thousands of people. Most spoke casually. Some spoke confidently. Very few spoke with the calm precision that came from years of operating under pressure. Emma finished the call less than 30 seconds later. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned toward the picnic tables as if nothing unusual had happened. But Robert noticed the small details. The way her eyes automatically scanned the yard before moving. The way she positioned herself where she could see both entrances to the backyard without appearing to pay attention. The way she remained relaxed while somehow remaining alert. They were habits, and habits were harder to hide than secrets. Derek, meanwhile, had no idea he was no longer the center of attention. He was busy telling another story about a business deal that supposedly involved 3 states, 6 investors, and a profit margin that seemed to grow every time he told it. Several relatives nodded politely. Others checked their phones. Emma quietly helped her grandmother refill a tray of baked beans. Robert walked over to the drink cooler and opened it slowly. He was not interested in the soda. He was interested in getting closer without attracting attention. As he reached inside, he glanced toward Emma. "Long day?" he asked casually. Emma looked up. "Not really. Work call. Something like that." Her answer was polite but brief. Robert smiled faintly. That alone told him something. Most people volunteered extra information. Emma did not. She answered exactly what had been asked and nothing more. Another habit. Across the yard, Derek noticed the conversation and immediately inserted himself. "Good luck getting details out of Emma," he announced. "She has been mysterious for 10 years. Several relatives laughed. "Nobody even knows what she does." Emma shrugged. "It is not very interesting." "See," Derek said. "That is exactly what somebody says when they have the most boring job in America." More laughter followed. Emma smiled politely. Robert studied her reaction. Or rather, her lack of reaction. There was no irritation. No embarrassment. No need to defend herself. She simply let the comments pass. That interested him even more. In his experience, truly capable people rarely felt the need to prove anything. The loudest people in the room were usually the ones trying hardest to be noticed. His eyes shifted back toward Derek. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "What about you, Emma?" one cousin asked. "You planning to stay in Texas for a while?" Emma shook her head. "Just a few days. Then you disappear again?" Derek joked. "Probably. You know," Derek continued, leaning forward, "one day we are all going to find out you work in a windowless government office processing paperwork." Several people laughed again. Emma laughed too. Not because the joke was funny, because it was easier. Robert noticed that as well. Then he noticed something else. A faded silver bracelet around Emma's wrist. It was simple and unremarkable unless you knew what you were looking at. Robert stared at it for several seconds. His expression changed slightly. He had seen one before. Not recently. Not often. But he remembered. The bracelet was not something a person bought at a mall. It carried a specific meaning among certain circles. Suddenly the call sign sounded even more familiar. Falcon. The word echoed in the back of his mind. Not from a mission. Not from a briefing. From stories. Quiet stories shared by serious people who rarely exaggerated anything. Robert slowly closed the cooler lid. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer wondering whether Emma Carter had a secret. He was beginning to wonder just how big that secret really was. Derek had always been good at reading a room. Unfortunately, he was even better at controlling one. By early evening, the barbecue had settled into a familiar rhythm. Plates were being refilled. The younger kids were roasting marshmallows near a portable fire pit. Conversations drifted from football to local politics to rising property taxes. Somehow, every topic eventually circled back to Derek. He sat near the center of the patio with a drink in one hand and an audience in front of him. Emma remained at the edge of the gathering, helping her grandmother clear empty plates from the tables. She seemed perfectly content staying out of the spotlight. That only made Derek more determined to drag her into it. "You know what always amazed me," he announced suddenly. Several relatives looked over. Derek pointed toward Emma. "She never tells anybody what she actually does." A few people smiled. Others exchanged curious looks. "Maybe because it is classified," one cousin joked. The table laughed. Derek laughed loudest. "Classified," he said. "Trust me, nobody is classifying spreadsheets." More laughter followed. Emma simply carried another stack of paper plates toward the trash bin. Robert Kane watched quietly from his lawn chair. He had spent most of the last 20 minutes observing rather than participating. The more he watched Emma, the more questions formed in his mind. But he was equally interested in watching everyone else. Families revealed themselves when they were comfortable. Derek leaned forward. "Seriously, though, has anybody here ever gotten a straight answer out of her?" "Not really," Anand admitted. "She always changes the subject." "Exactly," Derek said, "which means one of two things. Either she works for some secret government agency." He paused dramatically. "Or she has the most boring job in America." The crowd laughed again. Emma smiled politely and continued helping her grandmother. "Maybe I just like privacy," she said. "See," Derek pointed. "That is what people say when they have nothing interesting to talk about." Robert noticed something fascinating. Emma never challenged him. She never competed with him. She never tried to win. Yet somehow Derek kept pushing harder. It was as if her silence frustrated him more than an argument ever could. "Do you remember high school?" Derek asked the group. Emma was exactly the same, always disappearing into the background. A cousin nodded. "She was pretty quiet." "Quiet." Derek laughed. You could go 3 days without hearing her say 10 words. Several relatives chuckled. Emma placed another tray on the picnic table. I survived. Barely, Derek replied. Honestly, if life were a team sport, Emma would be the person sitting on the bench holding the water bottles. The joke earned another round of laughter. Robert studied Emma carefully. Most people would have looked embarrassed. She did not. If anything, she seemed mildly amused. That reaction reminded him of people he had known decades earlier. People who had learned that confidence did not require an audience. The retired SEAL glanced again at the silver bracelet around her wrist. The memory continued bothering him. He knew he had seen one before. Somewhere. Years ago. Then another detail surfaced. During her phone call, she had not sounded surprised. She had sounded prepared. There was a difference. Prepared people expected responsibility. Suddenly Derek stood and raised his drink. I have an idea. The yard quieted slightly. Since Emma refuses to tell us what she does, everybody gets one guess. Groans and laughter spread through the group. Teacher, someone called. Accountant, another guessed. Government contractor, said someone else. Derek shook his head dramatically after each answer. Nope. 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 Emma folded her arms and laughed softly. You all have way too much free time. Come on, Derek insisted. Give us a clue. There is not much to tell. Robert noticed her choice of words. Not nothing to tell. Not nothing interesting. There is not much to tell. A careful answer. Deliberately chosen. His curiosity deepened. Because for the first time, he was beginning to suspect that Emma Carter was not hiding an ordinary career. She was hiding a story. And judging by the way she protected it, it was a story far bigger than anyone at this barbecue could imagine. The guessing game continued for several minutes, and with every wrong answer Derek seemed to enjoy himself more. He paced around the patio holding his drink like a game show host, pointing at relatives as they offered increasingly ridiculous theories about Emma's career. Park ranger, one uncle suggested. Meteorologist, another guessed. Professional dog trainer, a cousin laughed. Emma shook her head at each answer, smiling politely but never offering any additional information. The evening sun had begun dipping lower behind the trees, covering the backyard in a warm golden light. String lights hanging above the patio flickered on one by one. The atmosphere remained cheerful, at least for most people. Robert Kane sat quietly near the edge of the gathering, watching details nobody else seemed to notice. Over the years, he had learned that secrets rarely revealed themselves through words. They revealed themselves through patterns. Emma's pattern fascinated him. Every time someone asked about her work, she redirected the conversation. Every time someone made a joke at her expense, she let it pass. Every time attention moved toward her, she shifted it elsewhere. Yet she never seemed uncomfortable. That was the strange part. People hiding ordinary things usually appeared nervous. Emma looked perfectly at ease. She simply chose not to talk. I give up, one cousin finally said. What do you actually do? Emma laughed softly. I work with a team. Derek immediately seized the opening. A team? That narrows it down to only about 100 million jobs. More laughter followed. What kind of team? Another relative asked. Emma paused. The kind that travels a lot. Still sounds boring, Derek said. You see? That is exactly what I mean. Nobody talks that vaguely unless their job involves endless meetings and paperwork. Robert noticed Emma's grandmother smiling to herself. The older woman never corrected anyone. She never defended Emma. Yet there was something knowing in her expression, as if she understood far more than she ever intended to share. Robert found that interesting. Family members often knew pieces of a story even when they did not know the whole thing. Across the yard, Emma was helping one of the younger children untangle a toy airplane from a lawn chair. She crouched beside him, fixed the problem in seconds, and handed it back with a smile. The child immediately ran off laughing. Simple, natural, unforced. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone seeking admiration. Robert had met decorated military personnel who spent every conversation talking about themselves. Emma appeared to be the exact opposite. That contrast made him even more suspicious. As twilight settled over the backyard, Robert finally stood up and walked toward the refreshment table where Emma was organizing cups and napkins. You always this popular at family gatherings? He asked with a faint smile. Emma laughed. Depends on your definition of popular. Fair point. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Robert casually nodded toward her bracelet. Interesting piece. Emma glanced down at the silver band. A gift. From someone important? Very. Her answer came instantly. No hesitation. No elaboration. Robert nodded slowly. Another carefully measured response. You have traveled a lot? He asked. Some. Domestic? Emma smiled. Mostly. Robert almost laughed. She was good. Very good. Every answer technically responded to the question while revealing almost nothing. The skill was not accidental. Before he could continue, Derek appeared beside them carrying another soda. There you are, he said to Emma. I was starting to think you escaped. Not yet. Too bad, Derek replied. The mystery career debate was getting interesting. Robert watched Emma carefully. She simply smiled. Nothing more. Derek shook his head. I swear, one day we are going to find out you have been making the whole thing up. Several nearby relatives laughed. Then Derek turned toward Robert. You have known her for what? 2 hours? Something like that. Tell me honestly, Derek said. Does she strike you as someone doing anything exciting? Robert looked at Emma. Then he looked back at Derek. His answer came slowly. Actually, he said, she strikes me as someone who knows exactly how much she should say. The laughter around them faded slightly. Derek blinked. Emma remained perfectly still. And for the first time all evening, Robert noticed something in her eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. As if she understood that someone had finally started seeing past the version of herself she showed everyone else. The conversation should have ended there. Most people would have laughed, changed the subject, and moved on. Instead, Robert's comment seemed to linger in the air long after he said it. Derek forced a grin. That sounds a lot more dramatic than it probably is. Maybe, Robert replied. His tone remained calm. Maybe not. Emma picked up a stack of empty cups. I think everybody is giving me way too much credit. That is exactly what I mean, Robert said. Derek laughed awkwardly and shook his head. You two are making this sound like some spy movie. Several relatives chuckled. The tension eased slightly. Then Emma's phone vibrated again. This time the sound was impossible to miss because the conversation around the patio had grown quieter. Emma glanced at the screen. The smile disappeared from her face. Not completely, just enough for Robert to notice. Her posture straightened by a fraction. Tiny, almost invisible, but it was there. Excuse me, she said politely. She stepped away from the patio and walked toward the far side of the backyard near an old oak tree. Robert watched her go. Derek rolled his eyes. Here we go again. Another mysterious phone call. Nobody responded. Even the relatives who normally laughed with him seemed less enthusiastic now. Something about Robert's interest in Emma had changed the atmosphere. Curiosity was spreading. Emma stopped beneath the tree and answered the call immediately. The distance should have made it impossible to hear anything. But a sudden lull in conversation carried her voice farther than expected. Falcon Actual. Robert felt his heartbeat quicken. Go ahead. She listened for several seconds. Understood. Another pause. I can be available tomorrow. More silence. Copy that. Then she ended the call. 4 short sentences. Nothing more. Yet Robert stared at the ground as if a puzzle piece had suddenly fallen into place. The phrase echoed through his memory. Falcon Actual. Not Falcon. Not Falcon 1. Falcon Actual. A very specific way of identifying oneself. His mind traveled backward through years of conversations, reunions, conferences, and quiet discussions among retired military professionals. Stories, rumors, respectful mentions spoken by people who rarely praised anyone. He remembered sitting at a veterans event nearly 6 years earlier. 2 former operators had been discussing an individual neither of them had actually met. One of them had used the phrase Falcon Actual. At the time, Robert had assumed it was a man. Most people would have. The story involved leadership, extraordinary judgment, and a reputation that had quietly spread through circles where reputations were difficult to earn. Robert remembered asking a question. The answer had stayed with him ever since. The funny thing, the operator had said, is that Falcon never talks about Falcon. At the time, Robert thought it sounded ridiculous. Now he was not so sure. Emma returned to the patio carrying herself exactly as before. No dramatic entrance. No announcement. No explanation. She sat beside her grandmother and began helping arrange desserts on paper plates. As if nothing had happened. Derek could not resist. Important call? Emma looked up. Just work. Work seems awfully interested in your barbecue. Sometimes. You know, Derek said, normal people usually tell their families what they do. Emma smiled. Normal people probably should. A few relatives laughed. Robert did not. His eyes remained fixed on Emma. The silver bracelet, the controlled answers, the call sign, the habits, the complete absence of ego. One detail alone meant nothing. Together they formed a picture. Not a complete picture, but enough. For the first time all evening, Robert became less interested in proving his theory and more interested in testing it. Because if Emma Carter really was the person he suspected, then everyone at this barbecue had spent the last several hours misunderstanding the quietest person in the yard. And judging by the confidence in her silence, she had allowed it to happen on purpose. The backyard had grown noticeably quieter as darkness settled across the neighborhood. The string lights hanging above the patio cast warm circles of light over the tables, and the conversations that remained had softened into smaller groups. Children were beginning to grow tired. Several relatives had started discussing when they needed to leave. Yet Robert Kane remained fully alert. The more he observed Emma, the more certain he became that coincidence could no longer explain what he had seen. He waited patiently for an opportunity. It arrived when Emma stepped away from the dessert table carrying a stack of empty trays toward the outdoor kitchen area. Robert followed a few moments later. Not aggressively, not suspiciously, just two adults helping clean up after a family gathering. Emma placed the trays on the counter and turned to leave. "Emma," Robert said quietly. She stopped. "Yes, sir." The answer immediately caught his attention. Most civilians rarely used that phrase naturally. Emma seemed unaware she had said it. Or perhaps she was aware and simply did not care. "Can I ask you something?" Robert said. "You can ask. Will I get an answer?" A faint smile appeared on her face. "Depends on the question." Robert laughed softly. "Fair enough." He leaned against the counter. "How long have you been using the call sign Falcon?" For the first time all evening, Emma did not answer immediately. The pause lasted only a second. Maybe two. But Robert noticed. "That is an unusual question," she replied. "That is not an answer." "No, it is not." The smile remained, but her eyes became more careful. Robert recognized the shift instantly. He had seen it countless times over the years. A professional deciding exactly how much information to release. "Let me ask differently," Robert continued. "Has anyone ever told you that you are difficult to read?" Emma laughed quietly. "More than once." "Good. Then I am not losing my touch." She folded her arms. "You were in the teams?" Robert nodded. 22 years. Emma glanced toward the backyard where her family continued talking. "Then you already know there are some questions people do not answer." Robert studied her for a moment. That response told him more than a direct answer would have. Not denial. Not confusion. Recognition. "Interesting," he said. Emma looked at him carefully. "What exactly are you trying to figure out?" Robert smiled. "Whether my memory still works." And, "So far, I think it does." Neither spoke for several seconds. The sounds of distant laughter drifted across the yard. Somewhere nearby a dog barked. Finally, Robert decided to test one more thing. "I attended a conference outside Virginia 6 years ago," he said. "A retired operator mentioned someone named Falcon Actual. Not a real name, just a call sign. He spoke about that person with a level of respect that got my attention." Emma remained silent. Robert continued. "The strange thing was that nobody seemed interested in discussing accomplishments. They talked about judgment, leadership, reliability. They talked about trust." Emma looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "Sounds like they were talking about somebody impressive." "That is exactly what I thought." Robert paused. "Then I heard your phone call." The silence that followed felt different. Not uncomfortable. Careful. Measured. Emma finally smiled. "You know, most people at family barbecues spend their time discussing football. I never liked football that much." "Clearly." Robert laughed. Then his expression softened. "Your family has no idea, do they?" Emma glanced toward the patio. Derek was telling another story. Several relatives were listening. Her grandmother sat quietly in the same chair, watching everything with gentle eyes. "No," Emma said. "They do not. By choice. By necessity." Robert slowly nodded. He understood. More than she realized. Some stories were not meant for public discussion. Some responsibilities came with silence attached. Yet one thing remained undeniable. Emma had never confirmed anything. Not directly, but she had also never denied it. And as Robert looked at her standing there beneath the warm patio lights, he became almost completely certain that the quiet woman her family treated like an ordinary mystery was carrying a reputation that extended far beyond anything they could imagine. When Emma and Robert returned to the patio, neither of them mentioned their conversation. To everyone else, it looked completely ordinary. Two adults had stepped away for a few minutes and come back. Nothing more. Yet Robert noticed that he now viewed the entire gathering differently. The jokes sounded different. The assumptions sounded different. Most of all, Derek sounded different. Not because Derek had changed, but because Robert finally understood how little the man actually knew about the person he kept mocking. Derek was standing near the cooler telling another story when he spotted Emma returning. "There she is," he announced. "The most mysterious woman in Texas." A few relatives laughed. Emma smiled and grabbed a bottle of water. "I think Texas has more interesting mysteries than me." "Not according to this crowd," Derek replied. "Half the family has spent the entire evening trying to figure you out. Sounds like they need a hobby." More laughter followed. Robert sat down and quietly listened. He had spent enough years around exceptional people to recognize one universal truth. The most impressive individuals rarely advertise themselves. The truly remarkable ones often went out of their way to appear ordinary. Emma seemed determined to do exactly that. "You know what?" Derek said suddenly. "I have a new theory." Groans and chuckles spread across the patio. "Here we go," one cousin muttered. Derek pointed dramatically at Emma. "I think she secretly enjoys this. I think she loves making everybody wonder what she does." Emma shook her head. "Trust me, I do not." "Then tell us." "No, see." Derek threw up his hands. "Exactly." The crowd laughed again. Robert noticed that Emma's grandmother was smiling into her coffee cup. She looked completely unsurprised by everything unfolding around her. It was the smile of someone who had spent years protecting a secret without ever speaking about it. Robert finally decided to say something. Not because he wanted attention, because he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable watching the conversation continue in the wrong direction. Maybe she does not talk about it because some work is not meant to become dinner conversation. The patio quieted slightly. Derek looked at him. "Come on, Robert. You cannot be buying into the mystery too." "Actually," Robert replied calmly, "I think I understand it better than most people here." Several relatives exchanged curious looks. Emma lowered her eyes toward her water bottle. Derek laughed. "Now I am interested." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Over the years I have met people from all kinds of professions. Pilots, commanders, specialists, leaders. Some of the best were surprisingly quiet." Derek folded his arms. "What does that have to do with Emma?" Robert looked directly at him. "Everything." The laughter stopped. Not dramatically, gradually, one conversation at a time. "You keep assuming that because someone does not talk about their accomplishments, they do not have any," Robert continued. "That is not how life works." Derek's smile weakened slightly. "Nobody is saying she has no accomplishments." Several relatives glanced at each other. The statement sounded less convincing than he intended. Robert nodded slowly. "Good. Because if there is one thing I learned during my career, it is that the people who carry the greatest responsibilities are often the least interested in discussing them." The silence deepened. Emma remained motionless. She neither encouraged nor interrupted him. "A long time ago," Robert said, "I heard professionals discussing someone they respected immensely. Not because of fame, not because of rank, because of trust. The kind of trust that takes years to earn." Derek looked confused. "What does that have to do with tonight?" Robert's eyes shifted toward Emma for a brief moment. "More than you think." For the first time all evening, several relatives stopped looking at Derek and started looking at Emma. Not with amusement, not with curiosity, with something else. The beginning of realization. And as Robert watched their expressions change, he understood that the evening had quietly crossed a line. The mystery was no longer whether Emma had a story. The mystery had become how extraordinary that story actually was. The backyard had become so quiet that the distant sound of crickets seemed unusually loud. Nobody had planned for the evening to unfold this way. A few hours earlier, it had been a simple family barbecue filled with jokes, stories, and familiar routines. Now nearly every conversation had stopped. People were no longer watching Derek. They were watching Robert. More specifically, they were waiting to hear why a retired Navy SEAL appeared so interested in Emma Carter. Derek shifted uncomfortably and forced a laugh. "All right, now you have everybody curious." Robert remained calm. "That was not my intention." "Well, it happened anyway." Several relatives nodded in agreement. Emma lowered her gaze toward her water bottle. "Robert, you really do not have to do this." Her voice was polite, almost gentle, yet Robert heard something inside it. Not fear, not concern, Respect. She was giving him an opportunity to stop. The fact that she offered it only strengthened his opinion of her. I know, he replied, but I think your family deserves to understand something. Emma sighed softly, but said nothing else. Robert turned toward the group. I spent more than 2 decades around people whose jobs required unusual levels of trust, discipline, and responsibility. Nobody interrupted. One thing you learn very quickly is that titles do not always tell you who the most capable person in the room is. Derek folded his arms. Okay, Robert continued. Sometimes the most capable person is the one nobody notices. The words settled over the patio. Several relatives glanced toward Emma. She looked exactly the same as she had all evening. Simple jeans. Simple shirt. No attempt to stand out. No attempt to impress anyone. Robert shook his head slightly. Years ago I heard stories about someone known only by a call sign. Derek laughed nervously. A call sign? Yes. Robert never took his eyes off him. And before you ask, no, I am not talking about a movie character. I am talking about a real professional whose reputation traveled through communities where respect is not given easily. The laughter disappeared. People describe this individual the same way every time. Quiet, reliable, humble. The kind of person others trusted completely. Emma stared at the patio floor. Her grandmother smiled faintly into her coffee cup. Nobody talked about awards, Robert continued. Nobody talked about recognition. They talked about character. A cousin finally spoke. Who was this person? Robert looked directly at Emma. That is what I spent most of tonight trying to figure out. The silence became absolute. Derek looked from Robert to Emma and back again. Wait a minute. Robert nodded slowly. The first clue was the call sign. Nobody moved. The second clue was the way she carries herself. Emma closed her eyes briefly. Robert. The third clue was everything else. He smiled gently. The things she does not realize she is revealing. Derek's confidence was beginning to disappear. You are serious. Completely. Robert stood up. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. I am not going to discuss details because they are not mine to discuss. He glanced toward Emma. And because she would never do it herself. Then he faced the family. But I will tell you this. The entire patio seemed to lean forward. While some of you spent years wondering why Emma disappeared for months at a time, others spent years trusting her judgment. He paused. While some of you joked that she must have a boring office job, other professionals spoke about her with extraordinary respect. Derek looked stunned. Robert's voice remained steady. And while some of you spent tonight laughing at her silence, I recognized something very different. Nobody spoke. Not even the children. Robert looked around the patio one final time. I recognized someone who never felt the need to prove her value because she already knew it. The words landed harder than any speech could have. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were true. Slowly, every eye turned toward Emma. And for the first time all evening, nobody saw her as the quiet cousin sitting at the edge of the barbecue. They saw someone they had completely failed to understand. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. The backyard that had been filled with laughter all afternoon now felt completely different. Derek stood motionless beside the cooler, staring at Emma as though he were seeing her for the first time. Several relatives looked uncomfortable. Others looked embarrassed. A few simply looked confused. The person they thought they knew no longer fit the picture in their minds. Emma, meanwhile, looked exactly the same. She did not stand up. She did not explain herself. She did not correct Robert or add dramatic details. She simply sat there holding a bottle of water beneath the glow of the patio lights. Robert watched the family process what had just happened. He had seen similar moments before. Not in backyards or at family barbecues, but in professional settings where assumptions collapsed and reality took their place. The silence was finally broken by Derek. Why did you never tell anybody? His voice sounded smaller than it had all evening. Emma looked at him for a moment before answering. Nobody asked the right questions. A few relatives exchanged glances. Derek let out a nervous laugh. I guess that is fair. Emma smiled. Besides, it never seemed important. Robert almost laughed at that. To her, perhaps it was not important. To everyone else, it clearly was. One of Emma's cousins leaned forward. So all those times you disappeared for months, Emma nodded slightly. Work. And the phone calls. Work. And the travel? Work. The answers remained short. Simple. Consistent. She offered no more information than necessary. Her grandmother finally set down her coffee cup. She has always been that way. Everyone turned toward her. The older woman smiled warmly. Even when she was a little girl. If she accomplished something, she never talked about it. She just moved on to the next thing. Emma shook her head with a faint smile. Grandma. What? The older woman replied. It is true. Soft laughter spread through the group. This time the laughter felt different. Not directed at Emma. Shared with her. The tension slowly began to disappear. Derek looked down at the ground for several seconds before speaking again. I owe you an apology. Nobody interrupted. Honestly, probably several. Emma studied him quietly. You do not owe me anything. Yes, I do. Derek sighed. I spent years assuming I knew everything about you. He laughed awkwardly. Turns out I did not know much at all. Emma considered that for a moment. Then she shrugged. Most people only know part of somebody's story. Robert nodded. That answer sounded exactly like something he expected from her. No bitterness. No victory. No desire to make anyone feel guilty. Just perspective. One of the younger children suddenly ran across the patio carrying an empty plate. Aunt Emma, can you help me get more pie? The timing was perfect. Emma immediately stood up. Of course. She walked toward the dessert table with the child holding her hand. The entire family watched her go. Not because she was revealing secrets. Not because she was explaining accomplishments. Because she was doing something remarkably ordinary. Robert smiled to himself. That was the final piece. The people he respected most throughout his life always understood one thing. Identity was not built on recognition. It was built on character. A few minutes later, Emma returned carrying slices of pie for several children. The conversations gradually resumed. People relaxed. The barbecue became a family gathering again. Yet something had permanently changed. Nobody looked at Emma the way they had earlier. The assumptions were gone. The jokes had disappeared. In their place was something quieter and far more meaningful. Respect. Robert sat back in his chair and watched the evening continue. Across the patio, Emma was helping clean up paper plates and folding extra chairs as if nothing unusual had happened. She never confirmed a title, never listed an achievement, never tried to impress anyone. She simply kept being herself. And in the end, that was what everyone remembered most. Not the mystery, not the call sign, not even the revelation. They remembered the quiet woman who never demanded respect because she had already earned it.